It was recently announced that Sword Art Online is getting a brand new original movie called Integral Domain, and it's scheduled to release in 2028. The second I saw the announcement, my first thought was, yeah, this is going to be terrible. And before the comments start filling up with people saying, wait a minute, how can you possibly know it's going to be terrible if you haven't even seen it yet? Well, that's exactly what this video is about. I'm going to explain why Sword Art Online, Integral Domain is certainly going to disappoint, and why I don't need to wait until 2028 to have serious doubts about it. This isn't me pulling a random prediction out of thin air. I'm not flipping a coin and hoping I'm right. I'm looking at the franchise's history, its creative decisions, its recent projects, and the patterns that have repeated themselves for years. When you look at enough evidence pointing in the same direction, eventually you can make a pretty educated guess about where things are headed. Sword Art Online has had more than a decade to convince me that it's turned a corner. Instead, I've watched it recycle ideas, play things safe, lean harder and harder on nostalgia, and repeatedly release projects that fail to live up to the hype surrounding them. At some point, that stops feeling like a coincidence and starts feeling like the franchise's identity. That's why I'm not buying into the excitement surrounding Integral Domain. I've heard the promises before. I've seen the flashy announcements before. I've watched fans convince themselves that the next project is finally going to be the one that changes everything, and more often than not, it doesn't. So in this video, I'm going to break down exactly why I think Integral Domain is heading down the same path, why I have so little confidence in the people making it, and why the warning signs are already there long before the movie has even hit theaters.
For starters, just look at Sword Art Online's track record. This franchise has spent well over a decade delivering one disappointment after another. Every time a new project gets announced, we're told this is the one that's going to bring back the magic. This is the one that's going to surprise everyone. This is the one that's finally going to do something different. And then it comes out, and it's the same story all over again. At this point, why should anyone expect Integral Domain to be any different? What has this franchise done recently that inspires confidence? Because from where I'm standing, all I see is a long history of questionable creative decisions, wasted potential, and a series that keeps relying on nostalgia instead of actually improving. That's why I find it so strange when people automatically assume this movie is going to be amazing just because it has the Sword Art Online name attached to it. If anything, that name should make you more skeptical, not less. A good reputation earns trust. A decade of inconsistency earns doubt. So when I say I already think Integral Domain is going to disappoint, I'm not pulling that opinion out of thin air. I'm looking at the franchise's history and asking a simple question. If they've spent years repeating the same mistakes, what exactly makes this movie the exception? For example, look at director Uwe Boll. The guy built an entire career on making movies that critics and audiences absolutely trashed. One bad movie? Sure, that can happen to anyone. 2 or 3. Maybe that's just bad luck. But after years of putting out one poorly received film after another, people stopped expecting greatness. His name became the warning label. So when another Uwe Boll movie comes out and it's terrible, nobody acts shocked. Nobody says, wow, I never saw this coming. The reaction is usually, yep, that checks out. That's what happens when you've established a consistent track record. And that's exactly the point I'm making. With Sword Art Online, after enough disappointments, people naturally lower their expectations. That's not being unfair. It's recognizing a pattern. When a franchise keeps making the same questionable decisions over and over again, it doesn't automatically earn the benefit of the doubt every time it announces something new. So when I look at Integral Domain and say it's probably going to disappoint, I'm not making some wild, baseless prediction. I'm looking at the franchise's history, seeing the pattern it's established, and assuming it's going to keep doing what it's been doing for years. Until Sword Art Online actually proves it's learned from its past mistakes. Expecting anything different feels more like wishful thinking than realism. Now compare that to someone like Christopher Nolan. He spent years building a reputation for making critically acclaimed films that audiences actually want to watch. Whether you personally love every one of his movies or not, the guy has earned the benefit of the doubt through a long history of delivering quality. When the Odyssey was announced, sure, there was plenty of skepticism. People questioned whether Homer's story could work on that scale, whether it was too ambitious, whether the casting decisions were authentic, or whether Nolan was the right person to adapt it. But none of that skepticism erased the fact that Nolan had already proven himself time and time again. His track record gave people a legitimate reason to believe he'd pull it off. And when the movie finally came out, it was exactly what a lot of people expected from him, another critically acclaimed film. That's what happens when a creator consistently delivers. Confidence isn't based on blind optimism. It's based on evidence. That's the difference. Christopher Nolan has spent years giving audiences reasons to trust him. Sword Art Online has spent years giving audiences reasons to be skeptical. So if people are willing to assume Nolan's next project will probably be good, but I'm assuming the next Sword Art Online movie will probably disappoint, those aren't double standards. They're conclusions based on two completely different track records. It's really just basic pattern recognition. This isn't some complicated theory, and it isn't me pretending I can see the future. I don't have a crystal ball. It's how people make predictions about literally everything. If a studio, director, or franchise has consistently put out great work, it's perfectly reasonable to expect the next project will probably be good. Not guaranteed, but probably. That's because they've already demonstrated that they know what they're doing. They've earned that confidence through years of consistently delivering quality. On the other hand, if the previous projects have been one disappointment after another, then it's just as reasonable to expect more of the same. Again, not guaranteed, but that's where the evidence points. You're not being cynical. You're following the trend that's already been established. People do this every day without even thinking about it. If your favorite restaurant has served you amazing food every time you've gone there, you expect your next meal to be good. If another restaurant has messed up your order 5 visits in a row, you don't walk in expecting perfection. You expect another bad experience because that's what history suggests is most likely. Sword Art Online falls into that second category. After years of questionable writing, wasted opportunities, and projects that never quite live up to their potential, why would I suddenly assume that this time will be different? Hope isn't a substitute for evidence. So when I say Integral Domain is going to disappoint, I'm not making an emotional argument. I'm making the prediction that the franchise's own history points toward. Could I be wrong? Sure. But based on everything Sword Art Online has done over the past decade, expecting another letdown is simply the most logical conclusion. Another reason I'm not optimistic is because it's largely the same creative team behind the project. And that's important because creative decisions don't just happen out of nowhere. The people making those decisions are the same people who made them before. If you weren't happy with the direction Sword Art Online has taken over the last several years, why would you suddenly expect a completely different result from the same creative minds? Maybe if this movie had an entirely new director, a new writer, and a fresh production team with a completely different vision, then I'd at least understand the optimism. A new creative team can breathe new life into a franchise. They bring different ideas, different priorities, and they're often willing to question what isn't working instead of repeating it. But that's not what's happening here. Instead, we're looking at many of the same people who were responsible for the franchise's previous creative decisions. If you think those decisions were great, then it makes sense to be excited. But if you think they've been making the same mistakes for years, then expecting a radically different outcome doesn't make much sense. Creative teams develop habits. Every writer has certain storytelling tendencies. Every director has a particular style. Every producer has priorities about what they think audiences want. Those patterns usually don't disappear overnight. That's why I keep coming back to the idea of pattern recognition. If the same people have consistently delivered stories that I found disappointing, then it's reasonable to assume their next story will probably reflect those same strengths and weaknesses. Not because they're incapable of improving, but because people generally continue doing what they've been doing unless something significant changes. And from everything we've seen so far, I don't see that significant change. The same franchise, many of the same creative voices, the same familiar characters, another original movie. None of that makes me think we're about to see Sword Art Online reinvent itself. It makes me think we're going to get more of exactly what we've already been getting. And if you've been disappointed by the franchise's recent output, that's not exactly a reason to be excited. A change in the creative team can completely change the quality of a franchise. We've seen it happen plenty of times. Take Dune, for example. The 1984 movie has its fans, but it's also been criticized for its storytelling, pacing, and how difficult it is to follow if you haven't already read the book. Fast forward several decades, and a completely new adaptation comes along with a different director, different writers, a different creative vision, and a different approach to the source material. The result was a pair of films that were far more widely praised by critics and audiences alike. Why? Because it wasn't the same people making the same creative decisions. A new creative team looked at the material from a completely different perspective. They emphasized different strengths, avoided many of the previous adaptation's weaknesses, and ultimately created something that resonated with a much larger audience. That's exactly why reboots and new adaptations sometimes succeed where older versions struggled. Fresh creative voices can make a huge difference. That's why I would have been much more optimistic if Integral Domain was being handled by an entirely new creative team. New writers might approach the characters differently. A new director might be willing to experiment with the storytelling. New producers might encourage bigger creative risks instead of relying on the same formula that's been used for years. But that's not what's happening here. Instead, this looks like another project being developed by many of the same creative minds that have been steering Sword Art Online for years. If you already believe they've been making poor creative decisions, then why would you expect those same people to suddenly produce something completely different? Could they surprise everyone? Of course they could. But history suggests that's the exception, not the rule. If you want dramatically different results, you usually need dramatically different people behind the scenes. That's what happened with Dune. That's what has happened with countless successful reboots over the years. Sword Art Online, on the other hand, doesn't appear to be going through that kind of creative reset. It looks like business as usual. And if it's business as usual, then I think it's reasonable to expect the end result to feel very familiar, for better or, in my opinion, for worse. Now, let me put it this way. If someone had announced tomorrow that Christopher Nolan was writing and directing Integral Domain, my entire outlook on this movie would change overnight. Why? Because Christopher Nolan has spent years earning people's confidence. When his name is attached to a project, there's a reason audiences get excited. He's built a reputation for making ambitious, well-crafted films that take risks and respect the audience's intelligence. That reputation wasn't created by marketing. It was earned through consistently delivering quality. So if Nolan were somehow directing this movie, I'd be thinking, okay, maybe this actually has a chance to be something special. Not because he's magically incapable of making a bad movie, but because his track record gives people a legitimate reason to expect something great. That's the key difference. Trust has to be earned. Sword Art Online hasn't earned that trust from me. Instead of looking at Integral Domain and thinking, wow, I can't wait to see what they're going to do, my reaction is, here we go again. That's because I'm judging the movie based on the people and the franchise behind it, not just the title on the poster. If one creative team consistently produces projects that impress audiences, it's reasonable to expect their next project might also be good. If another creative team has spent years putting out projects that leave people divided or disappointed, then it's equally reasonable to approach their next release with skepticism. That's not bias. That's experience. If Christopher Nolan were directing Integral Domain, I'd be excited because he'd have given me a reason to be excited. But that's not the reality we're living in. The people making this movie are the same people who've been steering the franchise for years. So why would I suddenly expect a completely different result? Nothing meaningful has changed. The logo is new. The title is new. The release date is new. But the people making the decisions are largely the same. And if you're expecting a completely different outcome from the same creative leadership, I think you're setting yourself up for disappointment. The exact same logic applies to the Sword Art Online games. Take Sword Art Online, Echoes of Aincrad. When the game came out, there were plenty of people complaining about how disappointing it was. But my question is, why were people surprised? Seriously, what were you expecting? This isn't a franchise that has spent the last decade putting out one critically acclaimed game after another. It's the complete opposite. The Sword Art Online games have had a long history of being mediocre at best and downright disappointing at worst. Yet every time a new one gets announced, a portion of the fan base convinces themselves that this is finally going to be the game that gets everything right. Then it comes out, and history repeats itself. People act shocked. Reviews are mixed. Fans start pointing out the same problems they've been pointing out for years. And suddenly everyone's asking, how did this happen? It happened because this is exactly what the franchise's track record suggested was most likely to happen. Again, this goes back to pattern recognition. If a developer or a franchise has consistently produced games that fail to live up to expectations, then expecting the next game to also disappoint isn't being unfair. It's the most logical prediction you can make based on the available evidence. Of course, there's always a chance that one game will break the trend. Every franchise is capable of turning things around. But until that actually happens, the safest assumption is that the next release will resemble the previous ones, not magically reinvent the series overnight. And that's why I think the games are actually a perfect comparison for Integral Domain. Every new Sword Art Online project gets announced with the promise that this one is going to be different. This one is going to restore everyone's faith in the franchise. This one is finally going to deliver on the series' incredible potential. Then it releases, and we're right back where we started. So when I see people genuinely surprised that Echoes of Aincrad disappointed them, I can't help but wonder if they were paying attention to the franchise's history. Because from my perspective, the outcome wasn't surprising at all. It was exactly what years of previous releases conditioned me to expect. And that's why I'm approaching Integral Domain the same way. Could it break the pattern? Sure. But until Sword Art Online actually proves it can consistently deliver quality again, I think it's far more reasonable to expect the pattern to continue than to assume this time will somehow be different. Just look at the reaction to Echoes of Aincrad. A lot of longtime Sword Art Online fans, the exact people you'd expect to be the most excited, ended up leaving negative reviews and warning others to stay away from the game. Think about that for a second. These aren't random people who already hated Sword Art Online. These are fans. People who have spent years following the series, buying the games, watching the anime, and supporting the franchise. If even a significant number of your most dedicated fans are walking away disappointed, that's a pretty bad sign. What's even more telling is that many of the criticisms weren't completely new. People weren't complaining about some bizarre one-off issue that nobody could have predicted. A lot of the complaints sounded familiar. Fans were once again talking about the same kinds of problems they've been discussing for years. That's why the backlash didn't surprise me. It felt less like an unexpected failure and more like another chapter in a trend that's been developing for a long time. And that's exactly why I'm approaching Integral Domain with so much skepticism. If the franchise keeps releasing projects that leave portions of its core audience disappointed, why should I suddenly assume the next one is going to reverse that pattern? What has fundamentally changed? Is there a completely different creative direction? A brand new philosophy? A dramatic shakeup behind the scenes? From everything we've seen so far, the answer appears to be no. So when people tell me I'm being too negative by predicting that Integral Domain will disappoint, I don't think I'm making some outrageous claim. I'm simply looking at the franchise's recent history and asking whether there's any concrete reason to expect a different outcome. Maybe the movie will prove me wrong. I'd actually be happy if it did. But until Sword Art Online starts consistently giving fans reasons to regain their confidence, I think skepticism is a far more reasonable starting point than blind optimism. And here's the part that really confuses me. If even longtime Sword Art Online fans are coming away disappointed, why on earth would I expect something better? Think about it from my perspective. I'm not someone who's already inclined to love everything this franchise puts out. I've been very open about the fact that I have a lot of issues with Sword Art Online. So if the people who are actually rooting for these projects to succeed are saying, this wasn't very good, why would that suddenly make me more optimistic? It wouldn't. If anything, it does the exact opposite. The franchise's biggest supporters are naturally going to give it more patience and more goodwill than someone like me. They're the audience that's most willing to overlook flaws because they genuinely want the next game, movie, or series to be great. They have every reason to hope the franchise succeeds. So when even those fans start saying, I don't recommend this, that's a warning sign. It's like a restaurant getting bad reviews from its regular customers. If the people who eat there every week are telling everyone else to stay away, why would someone who already wasn't interested suddenly decide to give it a chance? That's why I don't understand the expectation that I should be optimistic about Integral Domain. Optimism has to be earned. If the franchise consistently impressed its own fan base, then sure, I'd understand the excitement. But when even many dedicated fans are expressing disappointment with recent releases, expecting me, a longtime critic of Sword Art Online, to assume the next project will suddenly be amazing just doesn't make any sense. From my point of view, the evidence is pointing in the opposite direction. If the people most invested in the franchise aren't consistently satisfied, then why would someone who's been critical of it all along expect the next release to be any different? Another major red flag is that Sword Art Online has become completely reliant on nostalgia. Instead of moving the series forward, it feels like the franchise is constantly looking over its shoulder, hoping that reminding everyone of Aincrad and the original cast will be enough to generate excitement. Think about it. How many times has this series gone back to Kirito, Asuna, or Aincrad in one way or another? Every time there's a big announcement, it's always the same familiar faces, the same familiar locations, and the same promise that this time it'll somehow recapture the magic of the original arc. It's like the franchise itself has realized that its strongest selling point is reminding people of what they liked over a decade ago. And that's a problem. If your biggest marketing strategy is nostalgia, it usually means you don't have enough confidence in the new material to let it stand on its own. Instead of saying, here's an incredible new story that speaks for itself, the message becomes, remember the thing you loved back in 2012? Well, here it is again. At some point, nostalgia stops feeling like a celebration and starts feeling like a crutch. What's even more frustrating is that the Sword Art Online universe has so much untapped potential. There are countless virtual worlds, new technologies, unexplored time periods, and opportunities to focus on completely different characters. Instead of taking advantage of that enormous sandbox, the franchise keeps circling back to the same handful of characters because it's the safest possible option. Safe doesn't mean good. Some of the best franchises stay relevant because they're willing to evolve. They introduce new ideas, take creative risks, and trust their audience to follow along. Sword Art Online, on the other hand, increasingly feels like it's afraid to leave its comfort zone. Rather than building the future of the franchise, it keeps trying to recreate its past. And that's exactly why Integral Domain doesn't inspire much confidence. From the moment it was announced, it already felt less like the beginning of something exciting and more like another attempt to cash in on nostalgia. After seeing the franchise lean on the same formula for years, it's hard to believe that this time it's suddenly going to reinvent itself. Another reason I'm skeptical is the complete lack of creative risk. When I look at Integral Domain, I don't see a franchise that's trying to reinvent itself. I see a franchise that's playing it as safely as possible. Ask yourself this. What is this movie actually bringing to the table? Is it introducing a bold new direction for Sword Art Online? Is it taking the story somewhere fans never expected? Is it challenging the formula that's been around for over a decade? Or is it just another excuse to put Kirito and Asuna back on the big screen because they're guaranteed to sell tickets? That's an important distinction. Long-running franchises eventually reach a point where they have two choices. They can evolve, take risks, and potentially upset a few fans in the process. Or they can play it safe by recycling what's already proven to work. Unfortunately, a lot of franchises choose the second option because it's less risky financially. It may not produce the most interesting story, but it's the safer business decision. And that's exactly the vibe I'm getting from Integral Domain. Nothing about this announcement screams confidence. It feels less like the creators had an amazing story they just had to tell, and more like they had another movie slot to fill. Those are two very different things. Great stories usually start with a compelling idea. Corporate franchise movies often start with a release date. The problem with playing it safe is that audiences eventually notice. If every new project is built around the same characters, the same emotional beats, and the same familiar formula, then nothing feels exciting anymore. You're not watching because you're curious about what happens next. You're watching because you've seen this franchise before and you already have a pretty good idea where it's going. That's how series become stale. Not because they run out of characters or ideas, but because they stop taking chances. They become more concerned with protecting the brand than creating something memorable. And from everything we've seen so far, Integral Domain doesn't look like the movie that's going to break that cycle. It looks like another safe, familiar entry designed to keep the franchise going, not push it forward. Another thing that makes me skeptical is how obsessed this franchise has become with returning to Aincrad. We already got the progressive movies. The whole point of those films was to revisit the original Death game from a different perspective. Whether you like them or not, they were marketed around the idea of going back to the beginning and reliving the part of Sword Art Online that fans remember most fondly. Now, based on the promotional artwork for Integral Domain, it looks like we're doing it again. Really? How many times are we supposed to revisit the same setting before the franchise finally decides to move on? This is exactly what I mean when I say Sword Art Online has become overly dependent on nostalgia. Instead of exploring completely new ideas, introducing an entirely different virtual world, or taking the series in a bold direction, it keeps finding excuses to return to Aincrad because that's the safest possible marketing strategy. It's almost as if the people behind a franchise have realized that whenever interest starts to fade, they could just put Aincrad on the poster and hope fans get excited all over again. The problem is that nostalgia has diminishing returns. The first time you revisit an iconic setting, it can feel exciting. The second time, maybe there's still enough new material to justify it. But after a while, it starts feeling less like a creative decision and more like the franchise, running back to its comfort zone because it's afraid to take a risk. And that's disappointing because the Sword Art Online universe is supposed to be enormous. There are countless possibilities for new games, new worlds, new mechanics, and new characters. Yet somehow we always seem to end up back where we started. At some point, you have to ask whether the creators actually have confidence in their new ideas. Because if every major project keeps falling back on Aincrad, what does that say about the franchise's ability to create something equally compelling that's actually new? Maybe Integral Domain will have a legitimate reason for revisiting Aincrad. I hope it does. But based on what we've seen so far, it feels less like the story naturally demanded a return to Aincrad and more like the marketing department knew exactly what image would generate the biggest reaction from longtime fans. After the progressive movies, I was hoping the franchise would finally leave Aincrad behind and start looking toward the future. Instead, it looks like we're being asked to buy another ticket back to the same place, again. At the end of the day, audiences want something new. They don't want to keep paying for the same story over and over again with a slightly different title. Sure, nostalgia can get people interested once, maybe even twice. But eventually, people start asking a simple question. What else do you have? That's where I think Sword Art Online has been struggling. Instead of pushing the franchise in exciting new directions, it feels like it's constantly trying to recreate past success. Another trip back to familiar settings. Another familiar cast. Another story that promises to capture the magic of the early days. The problem is, you can't recreate the feeling of experiencing something for the first time. That original excitement came from not knowing what was going to happen next. Once you start chasing that feeling by repeating the same formula, it stops feeling fresh and starts feeling repetitive. People don't stay invested in a franchise because it keeps reminding them of what they loved 10 years ago. They stay invested because the franchise continues to surprise them. That's one of the reasons Obsession was such a hit. It felt new. It wasn't relying entirely on nostalgia or asking people to relive the same experience they'd already had. It introduced something different, and audiences responded to that. Whether you personally loved every aspect of it or not, it generated excitement because it wasn't simply repeating what came before. That's how successful franchises stay relevant. They evolve. They take risks. They experiment. Sometimes those risks fail, but at least they're trying to move forward instead of constantly looking backward. Sword Art Online, on the other hand, increasingly feels like a franchise that's afraid to let go of its past. Instead of asking, what's the next great idea? It often feels like it's asking, how can we make people nostalgic for Aincrad again? Those are two completely different mindsets. One is focused on creating the future. Other is focused on recycling the past. And when I look at Integral Domain, I don't see a movie that's trying to redefine sword art online. I see another project that seems content to revisit familiar ideas because they're comfortable and recognizable. Maybe that'll be enough for some fans. For me, it's not. After all these years, I don't want another reminder of why people love sword art online in 2012. And here's the biggest reason I'm not excited about Integral Domain. I honestly feel like I can already predict the entire movie before we've even seen a trailer. Seriously, let's play this out. The movie opens with everyone living their normal lives. Then suddenly, some mysterious new threat appears out of nowhere. Maybe it's a brand new AI. Maybe it's a secret game mechanic. Maybe it's a mysterious organization that's somehow been operating in the shadows this whole time. Whatever it is, it'll be presented as the most dangerous threat Kirito has ever faced. Sound familiar? Then the characters will spend the next hour trying to figure out what's going on. They'll split up, gather clues, have a few emotional conversations, and eventually realize that the only way to stop the villain is if everyone works together. Then comes the big action sequence. Kirito and the rest of the cast will fight wave after wave of enemies. There'll be plenty of flashy animation, dramatic music, and slow-motion shots designed to make everything feel incredibly important. Somebody will probably make an emotional speech about friendship, hope, or believing in each other right before the final battle. Kirito will struggle for a while. The villain will look unstoppable. It'll seem like all hope is lost. Then, somehow, the heroes will pull through anyway. The villain is defeated. The crisis is over. Everyone survives. The world is saved. Roll credits. If that ends up being anywhere close to the actual movie, can anyone honestly say they'd be surprised? That's the problem. Nothing about this feels unpredictable. A great story keeps you guessing. It makes you wonder where things are headed. It introduces ideas you never saw coming. It takes risks that make you question what's going to happen next. Integral Domain doesn't feel like it's aiming for that. It feels like it's following a formula that's become painfully familiar. Introduce a mysterious enemy. Raise the stakes. Have Kirito save the day. Restore the status quo. Repeat. Maybe there will be a few twists sprinkled throughout the movie, but I'd be willing to bet those twists won't fundamentally change the overall structure. They'll just be there to make the journey feel less predictable while still arriving at the exact destination everyone saw coming from the very beginning. That's why I'm having such a hard time getting excited. When I look at Integral Domain, I don't see endless possibilities. I see a checklist. Mysterious new villain? Check. World-ending crisis? Check. Big emotional speeches? Check. Over-the-top final battle? Check. Kirito saves everyone? Check. Happy ending with the status quo restored? Check. At some point, it stops feeling like a new movie and starts feeling like the same movie with different window dressing. And if I can predict the major story beats years before the movie even comes out, that's not exactly a sign that the franchise is doing something fresh or original. Another thing that immediately kills my excitement is the fact that this is an original movie. And that's a problem because anime original movies almost never have any meaningful, lasting consequences. Think about how these movies are usually written. They have to fit neatly into an already established timeline without breaking anything. That means the writers are incredibly limited in what they can actually do. They can't permanently kill off major characters. They can't drastically change relationships. They can't completely reshape the world. Because by the end of the movie, everything has to be put right back where it was before the opening credits rolled. In other words, the status quo has to survive. Once you realize that a lot of the tension disappears. Sure, the trailers will probably tease some massive threat that's supposedly bigger than anything Kirito has ever faced. They'll tell us the world is in danger. They'll act like everything is on the line. But deep down, we already know what's going to happen. Kirito is going to win. Asuna is going to be fine. The villain is going to lose. And by the time the credits roll, it'll be like none of it ever happened. That's the biggest weakness of these kind of stories. The stakes are artificial. The movie wants you to believe that everything is hanging by a thread, But the franchise itself won't allow anything truly permanent to happen. It's trying to create suspense while simultaneously guaranteeing that the status quo will be restored. That's not exciting. That's predictable. What's even worse is that these movies often introduce interesting characters, unique game mechanics, or genuinely cool ideas, only for them to disappear forever once the movie ends. Since the story has to avoid affecting the main series in any significant way, all of those new concepts end up feeling disposable. They're introduced, they serve their purpose, and then the franchise quietly pretends they never existed. So why should I get invested? Why should I care about a conflict that's almost certainly going to hit the reset button before the credits roll? Unless Integral Domain is willing to make bold, permanent changes that actually matter going forward. And let's be honest, there's no reason to believe it will. Then it's probably going to fall into the exact same trap as so many anime original movies before it. A flashy side story that feels important while you're watching it, only to become completely irrelevant the moment it's over. Just look at Ordinal Scale. It's the perfect example of what I'm talking about. Throughout the movie, the story tries to convince you that the stakes have never been higher. Characters are in danger, memories are being stolen. There's a brand new villain with a grand plan, and it feels like everything is building towards some massive, irreversible event. And then, everything gets resolved perfectly. The villain is defeated. The crisis is over. The main cast is okay. The relationships between the characters are basically unchanged. Life goes back to normal, and everyone moves on like it was just another adventure. Nothing fundamentally changes. That's the problem with stories like this. They spend 2 hours telling you that everything is on the line, but by the end, they've carefully restored the status quo so the franchise can continue exactly as it did before. It's like hitting the reset button. Now, imagine watching Integral Domain with that in the back of your mind. The movie can introduce the biggest threat in sword art online history. It can tell us Kirito has finally met his greatest challenge. It can flood the trailers with dramatic speeches, emotional music, and scenes that make it look like the world is ending. But why should I believe any of it? I've seen this movie before. Maybe not literally, but structurally. The franchise builds up an enormous crisis, only to wrap everything up neatly by the end, because it has to. The main characters aren't going anywhere. The overall timeline isn't going to be turned upside down, and the series has every incentive to leave the board looking exactly the way it did before the movie started. That's why it's so hard to get invested. When you already know the ending is almost certainly going to restore everything back to normal, the journey loses a lot of its impact. The stakes stop feeling real because the franchise has conditioned you to expect that everything will work out in the end with minimal lasting consequences. If Integral Domain follows the same formula, and based on Sword Art Online's history, there's every reason to think it will, then we're not getting a game-changing movie. We're getting another temporary adventure that ultimately changes very little. Another reason I'm skeptical is because original movies based on long-running anime franchises have a bad habit of feeling like glorified filler. Think about how these movies are usually structured. They're designed to fit somewhere into the existing timeline without disrupting the main story. That means they can't make changes that are too significant because the TV series or source material still has to continue as if nothing happened. As a result, these movies often end up existing in this weird middle ground where they're technically part of the franchise, but they don't actually matter all that much. You can skip them entirely, jump straight to the next season, and rarely feel like you've missed anything important. The main characters are still the same. Their relationships are still the same. The world is still the same. The overall story keeps moving exactly as it would have if the movie had never existed. That's basically the definition of filler. Sure, the movie might introduce a brand new villain, an exciting new location, or some flashy action scenes. It might even tease life-changing consequences along the way. But by the end, everything has to be wrapped up so neatly that the main storyline can continue uninterrupted. So what was the point? If I can completely skip a 2-hour movie and still understand everything that happens afterward, then how essential was that movie really? That's one of my biggest concerns with Integral Domain. Unless this movie introduces events that permanently affect the series going forward, there's a good chance it's going to end up being another self-contained adventure that exists almost entirely on its own. Once it's over, the franchise will quietly move on, and you'll realize almost none of it actually mattered. That's why I'm hesitant to get excited. I don't just want another side story that fills the gap between major arcs. I want something that genuinely pushes the franchise forward. And based on how anime original movies are usually handled, I'm not convinced that's what we're getting. Another reason I have a hard time believing this movie will have any real impact is because we already know what's coming next. The franchise has already established that the next major story arc is Unital Ring. That immediately tells you something important. Whatever happens in Integral Domain can't fundamentally derail the story that's already planned. Do you really think they're going to kill off Kirito? Of course not. He's the main character of Unital Ring. Are they going to kill Asuna? No. Alice? No. Sino? Lifa? The rest of the main cast? Obviously not. The movie could try to convince you that everyone's in mortal danger, but we already know the franchise has future stories that still need those characters. That alone removes a huge amount of the suspense. It's hard to feel invested in life or death situations when you already know the people involved have to make it to the next chapter. And it goes beyond just the characters. Do you think the movie is going to permanently reshape the world of Sword Art Online before Unital Ring begins? Probably not. Do you think it's going to completely change the relationships between the main cast? Probably not. Do you think it's going to introduce some earth-shattering revelation that completely rewrites everything we know about the series? I wouldn't count on it, because if it did any of those things, the next arc would have to deal with those consequences. And historically, anime original movies rarely put the main series in that position. Instead, they're usually designed to slide neatly into the timeline. They create the illusion that everything has changed, only to carefully restore the status quo before the credits roll, so the next canon story can proceed exactly as planned. That's why these movies often feel so inconsequential. Sure, they'll introduce a new villain. They'll create an enormous crisis. They'll tell you this is Kirito's toughest battle yet. They'll have emotional speeches, dramatic sacrifices, and enough explosions to fill a trailer. But by the time the movie ends, everyone who needs to be around for Unital Ring will still be around for Unital Ring. The world will still be recognizable. The main cast will still be together. The franchise will simply move on to the next story as if nothing truly irreversible happened. That's why I have a hard time taking the stakes seriously. The movie wants me to believe that anything can happen, but the existence of the next major arc tells me the exact opposite. It tells me there are certain lines this movie simply isn't going to cross. And once you know those lines exist, it's hard to pretend the stakes are as high as the movie wants you to believe they are. And if this movie ends up underperforming or getting a mixed reception, I already know what's going to happen next. Instead of asking whether the criticism might actually have some merit, a certain segment of the fan base is probably going to spend more time attacking the critics than talking about the movie itself. Every negative review, it's a bot. A critical YouTube video, it was probably written by ChatGPT. A low user score? Review bombing. Apparently, the movie itself can never be the problem. It always has to be some outside force conspiring against Sword Art Online. And here's where it gets even more ridiculous. Let's say actual Sword Art Online fans don't like the movie. You'd think their opinions would matter, right? They're the target audience, after all. They're the people who bought the tickets because they genuinely wanted the movie to be good. But watch what happens. Suddenly they'll be told they weren't real fans to begin with. Or they'll hear that they didn't understand the story. Or that they went into it wanting to hate it. Or that their devotion to the franchise wasn't strong enough. It's a convenient way to avoid the real discussion. Instead of asking, why didn't this work for people? The conversation becomes, those people don't count. That's one of the oldest tricks in the book. If someone likes the movie, they're held up as proof that it's great. If someone doesn't like it, they're dismissed as a fake fan, a hater, or someone with an agenda. It's a no-win situation. The only opinion that's considered valid is the positive one. Personally, I'd rather judge the movie based on the actual arguments people make, not whether they have enough Sword Art Online merchandise sitting on their shelf. Good criticism doesn't suddenly become invalid because the person giving it isn't enthusiastic enough about the franchise. If Integral Domain ends up being genuinely great, then people will have plenty of reasons to explain why it's great. But if the first line of defense is accusing every critic of being a bot, every negative review of being AI-generated, and every disappointed fan of not being a real fan, then that says a lot more about the quality of the discussion than it does about the quality of the movie. One of the biggest problems surrounding Sword Art Online isn't even the series itself. It's that a vocal portion of the fanbase refuses to engage with legitimate criticism. It doesn't seem to matter how well-reasoned the argument is or how much evidence someone brings to the table. If the conclusion is negative, then for some people, it's automatically dismissed. Instead of responding to the criticism itself, the response often shifts to attacking the person making it. You just didn't understand it. You went into it wanting to hate it. You're biased. You're not a real fan. At that point, the conversation is over before it even begins. The irony is that criticism is how every successful franchise improves. If fans refuse to acknowledge any flaws, then there's no incentive for creators to fix them. Every disappointing decision gets defended, every missed opportunity gets excused, and every new release is treated as though it could do no wrong simply because it has the Sword Art Online logo on the cover. That's not healthy for any franchise. You should be able to love a series while still admitting when it misses the mark. In fact, I'd argue that's what being a fan actually means. If you care about something, you should want it to be better, not pretend every decision is brilliant just because your favorite characters are involved. Unfortunately, whenever Sword Art Online receives criticism, a vocal part of the community seems more interested in defending the franchise's reputation than honestly discussing whether the criticism has any merit. And if Integral Domain ends up disappointing people, I wouldn't be surprised if we see that exact same cycle play out all over again. Instead of asking what the movie got wrong, the discussion will likely become about why the critics are supposedly the problem. That's a shame, because constructive criticism isn't what hurts a franchise. Ignoring its problems does. And those are the reasons why I'm already convinced that Integral Domain is going to be another disappointment. At this point, I don't think this is even a bold prediction anymore. It's the conclusion that the franchise has spent years earning. Sword Art Online has repeatedly shown audiences exactly what to expect, and for some reason people keep acting shocked when the next project turns out exactly the same. It's like watching someone touch a hot stove for the 10th time and acting surprised that they got burned again. Could I be wrong? Technically, yes. But I'm not interested in pretending that every new announcement deserves a clean slate when the franchise itself has done nothing to earn one. Blind optimism isn't a substitute for evidence. If a series has spent years making the same creative mistakes, then expecting those mistakes to suddenly disappear without any meaningful changes behind the scenes is wishful thinking, not rational thinking. Everything surrounding this movie screams more of the same. The same franchise, the same familiar characters. Another return to Aincrad. Another original story that probably won't matter once it ends. Another project that seems more interested in reminding people why they like Sword Art Online back in 2012 than giving them a reason to care in 2028. None of that makes me think this movie is going to break new ground. It makes me think it's going to recycle the same formula one more time and hope nostalgia does the heavy lifting. And if that happens, I guarantee there will still be people insisting it's a masterpiece before they've even had time to think about what they watched. That's become the cycle with this franchise. The announcement gets overhyped. The release gets defended no matter what. Then, a few months later, people quietly stop talking about it and move on to waiting for the next announcement, where the exact same process starts all over again. Personally, I'm done falling for it. Sword Art Online has had more than enough opportunities to prove it can consistently deliver great movies and games, and instead it's built a reputation for wasted potential. At some point, you have to stop judging the franchise based on what you hope it'll become and start judging it based on what it actually is. So no, I'm not buying the hype surrounding Integral Domain. As far as I'm concerned, this movie has every warning sign of being another forgettable, safe, formulaic sword art online project. Maybe it'll have gorgeous animation. Maybe it'll have a few cool fight scenes. Maybe the soundtrack will be great. But none of that matters if the story is just another predictable nostalgia trip that leaves the franchise exactly where it started. And if that's exactly what happens, don't act like nobody could have predicted it. The signs were there from the very beginning. Some people just chose to ignore them. Even if this movie comes out and everyone else is calling it a masterpiece, I'm still probably not going to love it. Why? Because popularity has never been a reliable measure of quality. I've disagreed with popular opinion before, and I'll disagree with it again. Just because millions of people enjoy something doesn't suddenly erase the problems I have with it. If I think the story is predictable, the characters are underwritten, the stakes are fake, and the movie relies too heavily on nostalgia, then those criticisms don't magically disappear because the internet decided to give it a standing ovation. I've never been the kind of person who changes my opinion just because everyone else is saying something different. If I think something is bad, I'm going to say it's bad. I don't care if it's the most popular anime movie of the year or if it ends up breaking box office records. A movie can receive endless praise online and still do absolutely nothing for me. At the end of the day, I'm judging Integral Domain by what's on the screen, not by Rotten Tomatoes, not by IMDb, not by my anime list, and definitely not by whatever the loudest people on social media happen to be saying that week. So if everyone else ends up loving it, that's fine. They're entitled to their opinion. I'm just not going to pretend I love it too. If this movie delivers exactly what I think it's going to deliver, a safe, predictable story that recycles familiar ideas while pretending to be something groundbreaking, then my opinion isn't going to change just because everyone else tells me I'm supposed to like it. I'd rather have an unpopular opinion that I genuinely believe than a popular opinion that I adopted just because everyone else did. I'm going to make up my own mind. I'm not the kind of person who waits to see what everyone else thinks before deciding what my opinion is. If I like something, it's because I genuinely like it. If I don't, I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because it's the popular opinion. Too many people let the crowd do their thinking for them. A movie comes out, everyone start calling a masterpiece, and suddenly people are afraid to criticize it because they don't want to be the odd one out. On the flip side, if everyone decides something is terrible, people pile on without even asking themselves whether they actually agree. I'd rather judge something for myself than outsource my opinion to the internet. If Integral Domain ends up getting universal praise, that's great for the people who enjoyed it. I'm not going to tell them they're wrong for liking it. But I'm also not going to pressure myself into liking it just because that's what everyone else is doing. My opinion isn't determined by review scores, social media trends, or whatever the current consensus happens to be. I've never believed that popularity automatically equals quality. History is full of movies, games, and TV shows that were massively successful while still having obvious flaws. Likewise, there are plenty of projects that were overlooked at first and only appreciated years later. Public opinion changes all the time. That's why I think it's a mistake to base your own opinion entirely on what everyone else is saying. So when Integral Domain finally comes out, I'll watch it with the same mindset I have for every other movie. I'll judge it based on the story, the writing, the characters, and whether it actually gives me a reason to care, not based on how loud the applause is online. If I end up liking it, I'll say I like it. If I think it's another disappointment, I'll say that too. I'd rather have an opinion that's genuinely my own than one that exists only because I followed the crowd. Another difference is that I'm not trying to protect a relationship with a studio. I'm not getting invited to exclusive premieres. I'm not attending early press screenings. I'm not worried about losing access because I gave a movie a bad review. That means I have no reason to sugarcoat my opinion. If I think a movie is great, I'll say it's great. If I think it's terrible, I'll say it's terrible. I'm not interested in watering down my criticism just to make it sound more acceptable or to avoid upsetting people. My opinion isn't for sale. I'm not sitting here wondering whether a negative review is going to hurt my chances of getting invited to the next big event or receiving an advance copy of the next release. I don't have to think about maintaining industry relationships or staying in anyone's good graces before I hit the upload button, because of who might be watching. I don't owe the studio a positive review, and I don't owe the audience fake enthusiasm. The only thing I owe is an honest opinion based on what I actually watched, not on what might benefit me professionally. That's how I intend to review this movie. No hype, no obligation, and no pretending that something is better than I think it is just because it's the popular thing to do. One question I keep coming back to is, who are these movies actually being made for? Seriously, who's still getting pulled in by the hype? At this point, Sword Art Online has been around for well over a decade. The franchise has had plenty of opportunities to prove itself, and by now most people have already made up their minds. If you're a hardcore fan, you're probably buying a ticket no matter what. If you've been disappointed by the franchise over and over again, another flashy trailer probably isn't going to change your opinion. So who exactly is left to convince? Every new announcement follows the same pattern. A teaser drops. The promotional artwork gets shared all over social media. People start declaring that this is going to be the project that puts Sword Art Online back on top. Everyone starts talking about how this time is different. Then the project actually comes out, and suddenly the excitement starts fading. The conversation dies down, people move on, and before long everyone is waiting for the next announcement so the cycle can repeat itself all over again. It's like the franchise has become addicted to generating hype instead of earning it. Instead of asking, how can we make the best movie possible? It sometimes feels like the question is, how can we make the next announcement as exciting as possible? Those are two very different goals. Maybe there are still people who get swept up in every announcement, and if that's you, that's perfectly fine. But after watching this franchise repeat the same cycle for years, I just don't find the marketing convincing anymore. A cool poster doesn't impress me. A dramatic teaser doesn't impress me. A mysterious subtitle doesn't impress me. I've seen all of that before. What impresses me is delivering a genuinely great story. That's the part that actually matters. Until Sword Art Online starts consistently doing that again, I'm going to have a hard time buying into the hype every time a new project gets announced. At some point, the excitement has to come from the quality of the finished product, not from another promise that this is finally the one that's going to change everything. Sword Art Online is one of the most popular anime ever made. It's also complete garbage. And that raises an obvious question. Who actually likes this trash? Because when you look at the writing, the characters, the world building, or the plot, it's hard to understand how a series this sloppy became such a massive hit. The answer is pretty simple. Sword Art Online is made for the tastes of very young viewers. The show's appeal is built around the same things that tend to impress children: overpowered heroes, constant wish fulfillment, shallow power fantasies, and a story that never asks the audience to think too hard about what's happening. Little kids don't care if characters are complex. They don't care if themes are developed. They don't care if the plot falls apart the second you stop and think about it. They see a cool guy with two swords beating everyone up, getting all the girls, and being the best player in the game, and that's enough. And that's basically Sword Art Online in a nutshell. It's not a story that succeeds because it's well written. It succeeds because it's designed to make the audience feel cool by association. Sword Art Online feels less like a thoughtful sci-fi story and more like a power fantasy aimed at the lowest common denominator. And honestly, this isn't just a Sword Art Online problem. Little kids is the answer to why a lot of garbage entertainment becomes massively successful. Take YouTube, for example. Look at MrBeast. His videos pull in hundreds of millions of views, but for a lot of adults, they're completely exhausting and insufferable to sit through. Everything is louder, faster, bigger, and more over the top than the last video. Every few seconds, there's a new challenge, a new explosion of excitement, a new reason not to click away. Yet they're incredibly popular. Why? Because the target audience isn't a 35-year-old looking for thoughtful storytelling or nuanced entertainment. It's younger viewers who are attracted to constant stimulation and spectacle. And that's exactly the same dynamic you see with Sword Art Online. The show's popularity isn't evidence that it's well written. Popularity only tells you that a lot of people enjoy something. It doesn't tell you why they enjoy it. Kids are often drawn to simple power fantasies. They want the strongest hero, the coolest abilities, the biggest victories, the fantasy of being special while everyone else stands around amazed. That's the formula. And Sword Art Online follows that formula almost perfectly. The protagonist is stronger than everyone else. He gets unique abilities nobody else has. Characters constantly praise him. Problems conveniently bend around him. And whenever the story has a choice between creating tension and making Kirito look awesome, it almost always chooses the latter. It's the anime equivalent of jingling keys in front of a toddler. And for the audience it's targeting, that's more than enough. And it's not just anime. You see the exact same pattern everywhere in entertainment. Look at blockbuster movies. Take the Minecraft movie. Critics weren't exactly calling it the next great cinematic masterpiece, and most adults walked out with the same reaction. Well, that was certainly a movie. Yet it made an absurd amount of money. Almost $1 billion. Why? Because box office numbers don't measure quality. They measure how many people bought tickets. And when a movie is attached to one of the biggest children's brands on the planet, that's a lot of tickets. The average adult isn't showing up because they're expecting a brilliantly written script, complex characters, or some profound artistic statement. They're showing up because their kids want to see the giant block game on the big screen. Kids don't care if the dialogue is clunky. They don't care if the story is predictable. They don't care if the characters have the depth of a cardboard box. They recognize the brand. They see familiar characters. They get a few jokes, some action scenes, and a bunch of references to something they already like. Mission accomplished. And that's an important thing to understand when people point to popularity as proof of quality. Popularity isn't proof of quality. McDonald's serves millions of customers every day. That doesn't mean it's the greatest cuisine ever created. A toy can sell millions of units. That doesn't make it a work of art. And a movie can make $1 billion without being particularly good. The same logic applies to Sword Art Online. People love pointing at its sales numbers, viewership, and popularity as if those numbers automatically end the discussion. But popularity only answers one question. Did a lot of people consume it? It doesn't answer the much more important question. Is it actually good? And when you start looking at Sword Art Online's writing instead of its sales figures, the answer becomes a lot less impressive. Before I wrap this video up, I want to give you a little bonus for sticking around until the end. I've spent this entire video explaining why I don't have much confidence in Integral Domain, but I don't want to end things on a completely negative note. It's easy to spend an hour talking about what doesn't work. It's a lot more useful to point people toward things that actually do. So, as a thank you for making it this far, let's talk about a few upcoming movies that I genuinely recommend and think are worth your time. These aren't recommendations based on hype or because everyone else says they're masterpieces. They're recommendations because I honestly think they have something special to offer. Whether it's outstanding writing, memorable characters, incredible world building, or stories that actually take creative risks, these are the kinds of projects that remind me why I love movies and anime in the first place. If you've been disappointed by Sword Art Online, or you're just looking for something that feels fresh instead of recycled, I think these are much better ways to spend your time. Some of them are well-known classics, while others don't get nearly the attention they deserve. But every one of them does something that I wish more modern franchises would do. They trust the audience, they take risks, and they aren't afraid to tell a story that stands on its own instead of relying on nostalgia or brand recognition. So if you're tired of watching the same formula play out over and over again, stick around for just a few more minutes. I think you'll leave this video with a much better watch list than another reminder to revisit Aincrad for the 100th time. After the massive success of K-pop Demon Hunters, studios started paying attention. What once felt like a gamble is now one of the hottest trends, and studios are quickly trying to claim their spot. Multiple projects are already in the works, each trying to capture that same mix of music, story, and worldwide appeal. So in this video, we're going through every K-pop movie currently in development and breaking down what we actually know so far. First up, we have K-pop Demon Hunters 2. There's no exact release date just yet, but it's currently planned to arrive sometime in 2029. The directors behind the first film are set to return for the sequel, which is a strong sign that it'll keep the same style, tone, and energy that made the original such a hit. The directors have already stated that they want to expand the scale, with more action, a deeper story, and an even stronger focus on the music. The main group is also expected to return. The story will likely pick up right after the first movie, especially with everything that was revealed about Rumi. a short film title debut. A K-pop Demon Hunter story has also been officially confirmed. This special project will dive into the origins of Huntrix, giving fans a closer look at how they first became demon hunters. Expect to see the early challenges, training, and pivotal moments that shaped the team into the heroes we saw in the first movie. It's a perfect way to explore the backstory and deepen the lore of the K-pop Demon Hunters universe. Perfect Girl is an upcoming K-pop horror movie that promises to be a chilling mix of Scream and Black Swan. The story follows a K-pop girl group as they prepare for their highly anticipated debut. Trainees will earn their spots, but tensions rise when a mysterious new trainee joins the competition. As the pressure and rivalries intensify, a series of terrifying attacks begin targeting the girls, turning what should be a dream opportunity into a nightmare. Fans can expect suspense, psychological thrills, and plenty of shocking twists along the way. The film is directed by Hong Won-ki and features a strong cast that includes Adeline Rudolph, Arden Cho, John Harlan Kim, and Mei Hong. Alongside them, several K-pop idols are also set to appear, including Somi, Nancy, Seon, and Chiron. With a mix of experienced actors and real idols, the movie is shaping up to feel both authentic to the K-pop world and engaging as a story. K-pop. Lost in America follows a K-pop group just days away from their big American debut at Madison Square Garden. But things take a sudden turn when they end up mistakenly stranded in Waco, Texas, far from where they need to be. With time running out, the group has to figure out how to make it to New York City before their performance. With no phones, no money, and no transportation, they're forced to rely on each other and think on their feet. The movie is designed as a fish-out-of-water comedy. The humor comes from culture clashes, language barriers, and the group trying to navigate everyday situations far outside their usual world. The cast includes Rebel Wilson and Charles Melton, bringing recognizable Hollywood presence, along with Ju Honey from Monsta X, adding an authentic K-pop connection. There's an untitled K-pop movie currently in development from Paramount Pictures. While details are still pretty limited, the basic premise follows a Korean-American college student who travels to South Korea and enters a major K-pop competition show. With a survival show format as a backdrop, the film has the potential to combine high-stakes drama with a closer look at what it really takes to become a K-pop idol. The film is directed by Benson Lee and features a diverse cast that includes Tony Revolori, Ji Young-yu, and Eric Nam. With a mix of established actors and talent connected to both Hollywood and the K-pop world, the casting reflects the film's focus on bridging cultures and telling a story that feels both global and authentic. That wraps up the list of K-pop movies currently in development. As you can see, there's a wide range of projects on the way, each taking a different approach to telling K-pop stories. Some are going for big action and fantasy, while others are focusing more on drama, comedy, or the reality behind the industry. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe for more content.